through Monday morning on Book TV. In Words and Rules, Steven Pinker shows how language is used, how it changes, and how we process words biologically. Mr. Pinker was hosted by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he directs the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. His presentation lasts an hour and a half.
Good evening. Hi. My name's Teresa Tobin. I'm the head librarian in the Humanities Library, and on behalf of the MIT Libraries and the MIT Press Bookstore, I'd like to welcome you to this Authors at MIT event. If you haven't been to one of these events before, this series celebrates the publications of the MIT faculty and staff whenever and wherever we can. And we hope that you will pick up flyers on future events. And Jeremy Granger, my co-convener, has written on the board for the next upcoming events. They're very diverse, as our faculty and staff are. The other thing I would like to mention to you, obviously you're here because you're interested in a cognitive science field, and so you may want to join the virtual community called Cognet. You can do that on the web address is cognet.mit.edu. And starting tomorrow, Professor Pinker will be the featured author, writer, thinker on Cognet in their hot science area. And I'd encourage you to dip in and join the conversation on the ideas presented in this book and beyond that. The members of this virtual community encompass linguists, philosophers, brain scientists of all kinds, psychologists, and I think you would find the conversation interesting and the work presented interesting. So cognet.mit.edu. I don't really think that Professor Pinker needs much of an introduction to us here at MIT. I think he's well loved and well known in the institution by students and others alike. And so I won't go on. You're here to hear him and not me. I have just one other announcement. When it comes time for the question and answer period, we would really appreciate it, as would C-SPAN, who is taping this for television, if you would queue up at the microphone right here to ask your question. If not, no one will know the question that Professor Pinker is answering. Also, Professor Pinker will sign books after the question and answer period, and he'll do that right here in the front of the room. So enjoy, and thank you, Professor Pinker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back in the classroom, although under different circumstances, the circumstances of the author book tour, whose pleasures are best summed up in the following cartoon. Yes, a lot of people ask me that. The restroom is down the hall on the right. Now, language comes so naturally to us that we're apt to forget what a strange and miraculous gift it is. But think about what you're doing. You're going to sit patiently for an hour listening to a man make noise as he exhales. Now, you're not doing it because the sounds are particularly mellifluous, but it's because I've encoded my thoughts into the precise sequence of hisses and hums and squeaks and pops that I make as I exhale. You have the ability to extract the thoughts from that sequence of noise, allowing us to share ideas. Now, over the next hour, the thoughts that I'm going to try to get you to think are about this ability itself, language, but with a slightly different sequence of squeaks and pops. I could be causing you to think thoughts about anything from theories of the origin of the universe to the latest twists in your favorite soap opera. This is what I call the miracle of language, its vast expressive power. And the first question that a science of language has to address is, what's the trick? How do we manage to fill each other's heads with so many different kinds of ideas? And the thesis of Words and Rules is that there isn't one trick, but two. And both of them were named by 19th century continental linguists. The first trick is the memorized word, what Ferdinand de Saussure called the arbitrary sign. For example, the word duck doesn't look like a duck or walk like a duck or quack like a duck, but I can use it to get you to think the thought of a duck, because all of us at some point in our lives have memorized an association between that sound and that thought. That means that something has to be stored in memory to capture the association, and in simplified form it might look something like this. An entry in the mental dictionary would have to have a label for the word itself, some representation of its sound, duck, and then some kind of representation of its meaning. Now, though this is simple, it confers a number of advantages. For one, because human memory is capacious, there is a large number of concepts that we can communicate using words. It's been estimated that a typical high school graduate knows on the order of 60,000 different words, which works out to a rate of learning them of about 1 every 2 waking hours starting at the age of 1. A highly literate person might know at least twice that number. And the brain is equipped to use words swiftly. It takes only about 1/4 of a second or less for the brain, given a meaning, to retrieve its sound in speech, or given its sound to retrieve its meaning in comprehension. On the other hand, words have some disadvantages. Since there's a finite number of them, you're restricted to the concepts for which your language has words, and words are slaves to memory. If you're the only one who has memorized a word, you may as well not know it at all, because no one will know what you're talking about. And this brings me to the second trick behind language, combinatorial grammar, what Wilhelm von Humboldt called the infinite use of finite media. The ability to arrange words into phrases and sentences in which the meaning of the sentence can be computed from the meanings of the individual words and the way that they're arranged. Now, for a speaker and hearer to share ideas that way, they both must have some kind of stored protocol or recipe or grammar that tells them how words might be arranged. And again, in simplified form, they might look something like this. A sentence in English is composed of a noun phrase, the subject, followed by a verb phrase, the predicate. The verb phrase is composed of a verb, followed by a noun phrase, the object, followed by a sentence, the complement. Now, the power of rules comes from the fact that they are built out of symbols. In particular, the verb phrase symbol that is specified by the sentence rule also occurs as the label of its own rule, with the result that one kind of phrase can be plugged inside another, and the words also bearing symbolic labels can be plugged into slots in the sentence structure, giving a speaker the ability to compose new combinations of words on the fly. Now, the advantages of combinatorial grammar are numerous. One of them is that by combining symbols, they allow us to express new combinations of ideas. There's a cliche in journalism that when a dog bites a man, that isn't news, but when a man bites a dog, that's news, and that's the beauty of grammar. It allows us to convey news by rearranging a fixed set of words in an unlimited number of new combinations. Also, because the rules of grammar are couched in symbols like noun and verb, the same knowledge that allows you to say dog bites man also allows you to say a Big Bang created the universe. Because grammar is a combinatorial system, the number of combinations grows exponentially with the length of the sentence. If there are 10,000 choices for a noun with which to begin a sentence and 4,000 choices for the verb to continue it, you already have 40 million possibilities for the first 2 words of a sentence, and the number of options explodes from there. The psychologist George Miller once estimated that a person has the capacity to produce or understand 100 million trillion different sentences, 20 words long or shorter. As the late Carl Sagan might have put it, billions and billions of sentences. And indeed, the number of sentences that we can produce using grammar is not just enormous, but in a technical sense, it's unlimited, infinite, thanks to a trick of grammar called recursion. Remember that a sentence contains a verb phrase, and the rule for a verb phrase says that it can contain a sentence. That means that you can embed a sentence inside a sentence, and a sentence inside a sentence inside a sentence, and so there is no limit to the length of a sentence you can utter, and hence no limit to the number of different ideas that you can convey using grammar. Now, it turns out that this is not a banal claim, because the opposing claim that there is a longest sentence actually has been made in the literature. Which literature? Well, what else? The Guinness Book of World Records, which has an entry for the world's longest sentence. This is true. You could look it up. It's 1,300 words long, and it comes from a novel by William Faulkner, which will come as no surprise to those of you who've read the novels of William Faulkner. Well, I won't reproduce all 1,300 words, but here's the way it begins. They both bore it as though in deliberate, flatulent exaltation, and it runs on from there. But I have an announcement to make this evening, which is that this, in fact, is not the world's longest sentence. And I have been tempted to achieve immortality in Guinness by submitting the following record breaker. Faulkner wrote, they both bore it as though in deliberate, flatulent exaltation. Unfortunately, I then realized that this would not be immortality, but only the proverbial 15 minutes of fame, because any one of you could then submit, Guinness noted that Faulkner wrote, Pinker mentioned that Guinness noted that Faulkner wrote, who cares that Pinker mentioned that Guinness noted that Faulkner wrote, ... Well, grammar is a wonderful thing, allowing us to express an infinite number of ideas in words. Are there any disadvantages to grammar? Well, there are, and I think they're best appreciated by imagining what a language would be like if it had nothing but grammar, no memorized words. Well, in fact, we don't have to imagine it, because such languages have been devised. During the Enlightenment, it was an affront to their sensibilities that people had to memorize tens of thousands of arbitrary pairings by rote. And there were a number of ingenious artificial languages, perfect languages, devised at the time. The most famous is the analytical language of John Wilkins, the subject of a wonderful story by Jorge Luis Borges and a book by Umberto Eco. Wilkins said that we should, by learning the names of things, be instructed likewise in their natures. For example, in his language, the word zeta meant dog, but you didn't have to memorize that fact. You could deduce it, because Z stood for animal, I for quadruped, T for rapacious terrestrial European canine, and then A pinpointed the species. Similarly, you could compute that Deba was a portion of the first terrestrial element, aka flame, and that Koba was a consanguineous relation of direct ascendant, to wit, a father. Now, needless to say, this scheme did not catch on. And it's easy to see why not. It requires complex mental computation for every word. Every time someone opens his mouth, you've got to play a game of 20 questions, letter by letter, to figure out what he's referring to. Also, all of this combinatorial power is overkill for most everyday concepts. We just never have to talk about a fire with 4 legs or a portion of a father, and so a system that gave us this power is really going to waste. It suggests that the design of real human languages extract the advantages of both these tricks. We have words for common entities, for the ducks and dogs and men, for which the psychological mechanism is memory. And we have grammatical rules for novel combinations of entities, for the men biting dogs and the Big Bangs creating universes, for which the mental mechanism is online computation. Well, a test of this idea would be to find some corner of language where words and rules express the same ideas, but are still psychologically and ultimately neurologically distinguishable. And the point of words and rules is that we do have such a test case, and they're what we know and loathe as regular and irregular forms. Now, just to give you a little brush up on your elementary school grammar, verbs in English come in 2 flavors. We have regular verbs like walk, walked, jog, jogged, kiss, kissed, and so on. These are predictable. Verb after verb, you form the past tense by adding the suffix ed. It's an open-ended class There are thousands of existing regular verbs in English, and new ones are being added to the language all the time. When the verb to fax came into common parlance about 15 years ago, you didn't have to run to the dictionary to look up its past tense. You could deduce that it was faxed. Similar for new words like to spam, to snarf, to mung, to mosh, and to dis. You can guess that the pasts are spammed, snarfed, munged, moshed, and dissed. Even children do it. If you bring a 4-year-old into the lab and say, here is a man who knows how to wug, he did the same thing yesterday, they will fill in the blank by saying wugged, even though they've never heard that before because it's a novel word. They must have computed it there and then. And in a sense, all children are participants in an experiment like that because children go through a stage in which they make errors such as bringed and cummed and putted and taked. And this brings me to the second flavor of verb in English, the irregular verbs. Verbs like bring, brought, hit, hit, go, went, sing, sang, sleep, slept, make, made, ring, rang, fly, flew. The irregulars contrast with the regulars along every dimension. Unlike the monotonous regulars, where verb after verb they have the same past tense form, the irregulars are unpredictable and quirky. The past of sink is sank, but the past of cling is not clang but clung. The past of think is not thank or thunk but thought. And the past of blink is neither blank nor blunk nor blot, but is regular, blinked. Also, it's a closed class. There are only 165 irregular roots in contemporary English, and there haven't been any recent new ones. Well, this leads to a simple theory, that irregular forms are words that are just memorized in the same way as duck or dog, but one of them, the word brought, is simply linked to the separate word bring, one being the past tense of the other. Regular forms, in contrast, don't have to be memorized because you can create them on the fly with a rule and throw them away because you can always create them again the next time you need one. All you need to store is the stem, and when you want a past tense, you join ed to it using the rule. Their interaction is also straightforward. If a word can provide its own past tense form from memory, the rule is blocked. That's why we adults don't say things like braked and cummed and putted. Elsewhere, or by default, the rule applies, and that's why both adults and children can say things like wugged and faxed and spammed and moshed. Well, I could end the talk here, and Words and Rules would be over after its first chapter, were it not for a complication. And that is that the irregular verbs are shot through with patterns. You find families of similar forms like keep, kept, sleep, slept, feel, felt, dream, dreamt, wear, wore, bear, bore, tear, tore, swear, swore, string, strung, swing, swung, sting, stung, fling, flung. This is not what you'd expect if the irregulars were a laundry list of items, each tucked into a separate pigeonhole. Moreover, these aren't just inert patterns in the language, but every once in a while they are generalized. Children will occasionally make errors like bring, brang, bite, boat, and wipe, wope. In the history of the language, every once in a while one of these new innovations will catch on. Quit and caught are only about 200 years old in English. Jane Austen used quitted, and George Washington used catched, for example. And the most recent irregular, snuck, sneaked into the language only about 100 years ago. This is especially obvious when you compare dialects of English, and in many non-standard British and American dialects you find forms like drag, drug, help, holp, climb, clum, or one that President Clinton recently used when the Republicans saw the budget, they swole up and died. He really said it. Now, as an experimental psychologist, I've been trained not to accept anything as a fact until it can be proven in the laboratory on either rats or sophomores. To my knowledge, no one has tested irregular verbs in rats, but if you bring a bunch of sophomores into the lab and you say, what is the past tense of to spling, about 80% of them will say splang or splung. Now, the master of this process was the famous linguist, baseball pitcher, and radio announcer, Dizzy Dean, who once gave the following play-by-play. The pitcher wound up and flanged the ball at the batter. The batter swang and missed. The pitcher flanged the ball again, and this time the batter connected. He hit a high fly right to the center fielder, who was all set to catch the ball, but at the last minute his eyes were blown by the sun and he dropped it. The question is, how do we explain the bit of Dizzy Dean that's present in all of us? And there have been two alternatives to the words and rules theory that take one of the components and stretch it to account for the phenomenon ordinarily attributed to the other. According to the theory of generative phonology from our colleagues here at MIT, Noam Chomsky and Morris Halle, and I'm privileged to see Professor Halle here in the audience, who no doubt will explain to me after the talk why I'm completely wrong. According to this theory, rules rule. There are not only rules for the regular verbs, but there is a set of verbs for the irregulars that change vowels, such as replacing an I with an A. But I think there's a problem for this theory, and that is to target the right verbs to which the rule should apply. How do you get, for example, the I to A rule to apply to string, sting, and fling, but not, say, to wish, wash, fish, fush, or fib, fub? There are two alternatives. One of them is to stipulate them in a list, and that's how it was done in the original theory. And the problem is that that leaves unexplained why the words on the list are so similar, why so many of the words begin in a consonant cluster like stra or fla or cla and end in a particular set of consonants. If it was simply a list to which the rule was applied, nothing would prevent the verbs from having any sound as long as they had the I in them. The other alternative would be to distill out the pattern that the verbs share and append it as a condition to the rule, such as only change I to A if the verb matches the condition consonant, consonant, I, and then the vowel. The problem here is that no pattern will exactly lasso the verbs that undergo one of these rules. This rule, for example, falsely includes bring, whose past is not brang but brought, brung but brought, and spring, whose past is not sprung but sprang. And it also falsely excludes a verb like stick, which should be affected by the rule, but whose final consonant, K, misses the targeted consonant by a whisker, and it falsely excludes spin, spun, which also should be affected by the rule, but it misses because its final vowel misses by a different whisker. Well, this leads to something completely different. The theory of artificial neural networks, or connectionism. According to this theory, there are no rules. There are just analogies from memory, a kind of beefed up memory called a pattern associator, where the trick is, instead of linking a word to a word, you link the sounds of a word to the sounds of a word. In one of these networks, you have a bunch of units. Each unit stands for a bit of sound in the verb, and you represent a verb by turning on the units that correspond to the sounds it contains. You have a similar bank of units for the past tense form. Every input is connected to every output. The model is trained by giving it pairs like stick, stuck, walk, walked, come, came, and so on. It soaks up correlations between patterns of a sound in the input and a sound in the output, like ing to ung or ok to oct. That gives it the ability not only to learn several hundred words, but to generalize them to new similar words. After it learns fling, it doesn't have to be trained on cling, because ing in fling and the ing in cling literally share the same representational real estate, and so anything that's been associated with the sound for one word automatically transfers to similar words. Well, here the problem is generalizing properly. Pattern associators generalize to new words that are similar to old words, and that works okay for irregular patterns where people do more or less the same thing. If people or a pattern associator learns cling clung, they will both generalize to spling splung. It also could work in theory for the regular pattern as long as the new word is similar to old regular verbs. So if you present people and a pattern associator with a nonsense verb like to plip, which is similar to clip, flip, trip, slip, snip, trip, whip, zip, and so on, then both people and the model will correctly guess that its past ought to be plipped. However, it doesn't work with new words that are not similar to old words, like to plomp, which doesn't rhyme with anything in English and indeed violates some of the sound pattern of English. Here, though, people can generalize the pattern to a verb like that, regardless of its sound, but pattern associators cannot. If you ask people what's the past of plomph, they'll say plomphed. The best the model could come up with was bro. Similarly, people say trilbed, the model came up with treelilt. People say smeeged, the model came up with leaflog. People can guess frilled, the model came up with frieseled. Well, this is instructive because it highlights an aspect of language that we take for granted, namely the use of mental symbols or variables, such as verb, which can stand for an entire class of words regardless of their sound content. In comparison, a pattern associator, which doesn't have a variable, can only associate bits of sound with bits of sound if it is then surprised with a new word that doesn't overlap in sound with the ones that it's been trained on. It has nothing to fall back on, and instead can only cough up a hairball of bits and pieces that are the closest to the ones that it has been trained on. Well, this leads to a modification of the words and rules theory, which is basically the old theory but with a twist. It says that irregulars are words that are stored in memory. The twist is that memory is not just a list of slots, but is partly associative, linking sounds to sounds in approximately the way that a pattern associator memory might. This explains why people generalize irregular patterns to similar words as in spling, splung, or blind, blound. However, I'm going to present evidence that we still need rules, in particular for regular forms, to explain how people can generalize the regular pattern to any word, whether it's similar or dissimilar, familiar or unfamiliar. The prediction of the theory is that people should be able to apply the regular ED pattern whenever memory fails for any reason that memory fails. And that I'm going to show you how this simple prediction explains a wide variety of facts about language and how people use it, including where regular and irregular forms come from, the logic behind apparent grammatical quirks, the use and misuse of rules by children, where language resides in the brain, and how and why languages differ. And I'm going to begin with the question of where regular forms come from, where interesting evidence simply comes from the statistical structure of the English language. Here's a top 10 list. Top 10 verbs in English in order of number of occurrences in 1 million words of text. And they are be, have, do, say, make, go, take, come, see, get. Notice that all 10 of these 10 are irregular. Be, was, have, had, do, did, say, said, make, made, go, went, take, took, come, came, see, saw, and get, got. Now, there can't be a bottom 10 list for frequency of words in English, because it turns out there's a 788-way tie for last place. Last place being 1 in 1 million, which of course is the lowest frequency that you can measure in 1 million words of text. But I'll present the first 10 of these words in alphabetical order. They are abate, abbreviate, abhor, ablate, abridge, abrogate, acclimatize, acculturate, admix, adulterate. Notice that all 10 of these are regular: abated, abbreviated, abhorred, and so on. There's a massive correlation in English and most languages between frequency and irregularity, and there's a simple explanation for why. Irregulars depend on memory because they're idiosyncratic and have to be learned individually. Memory depends on frequency. The more often you hear something, the better you remember it. If any word declines in popularity, it may not be memorized uniformly by a generation of children. The speakers will then default to the regular ED, converting that verb from irregular to regular for their generation and then for all subsequent generations. And in fact, there's some evidence that this is exactly what's happened in the recent history of English. Old and Middle English had more than twice as many irregular verbs as we find in the language today. If Chaucer were in this room, he would tell you that the past of cleave is clove. Likewise, abide, abode, chide, chid, crow, crew, gripe, grope, writhe, rothe, and many others. Turns out that the common words in Old and Middle English have stayed irregular. The rarer ones, like chide and gripe, have become regular. Indeed, you can feel this force of history acting even today, where some of the remaining infrequent irregulars sound a bit strange, and you can feel them slipping out of the language right before our ears. For example, complete the following conjugation. I stride, I strode, I have stridden? Kind of, but it doesn't sound exactly right. Similarly, smite, smote, slay, slew, bid, bade, forsake, forsook all have a kind of archaic, recherché feel to them, and one can predict that in 100 years they will have gone the way of chid and grope. In contrast, low-frequency regular words sound just fine. If I ask you to conjugate this sequence, I abrogate, I abrogated, I have abrogated, there's no problem, even though abrogated has the same frequency in the language as smote. Now, you might object that, well, sure, smote sounds a little strange, but it's not as if I go around using the verb to smite every day either. Maybe it's not that the past tense form is rare and hence weak in memory, but the verb as a whole. But in fact, I'm going to show you that an infrequent irregular form can sound strange even when the verb itself is familiar. And you can find that by looking at idioms or cliches where the verb is only used in one tense, so the verb is familiar, then force it into a different tense and see how you react to it. Take the verb to forego, for example. It's not very common, except in the sarcastic expression to forego the pleasure of, as in the sentence, "You'll excuse me if I forego the pleasure of watching the video of your wife giving birth." But now, if you force it into the past tense, you get, "Last night I forwent the pleasure of watching Herb's vacation slides," which is rather peculiar. Similarly, you could say, "I don't know how she bears that guy," but it's kind of odd to say, "I don't know how she bore that guy." You might say, "I dig the Doors man," but it's a little strange to say, "In the 60s, your mother and I dug the Doors son." Here's another example from a comic strip called Zits, where one teenager says to the other, "This week totally bit." Bit? Okay, this week bite it. That can't be right either. This week is totally bitten? Almost, but not quite. Back on Monday, I didn't know this week was going to bite so bad. I hate conjugating irregular vulgarities. Note, however, that there is no problem in conjugating regular vulgarities. If the first teenager had said, "This week totally sucked," there would be nothing to do a comic strip about. And indeed, in general, an infrequent regular sounds as good or bad as the verb itself because, by this theory, it's simply composed of the verb itself. So if you find verbs that have the same frequency distribution as, say, forwent and bore, you'd find things like, "I don't know how she copes with him." Put that into the past tense and you get, "I don't know how she coped with him." No laughter. "She doesn't suffer fools gladly." None of them ever suffered fools gladly. Again, no problem at all. The explanation is straightforward. An irregular form, like bear bore, is stored as two separate lexical entries, and one of them can be nice and strong, while the other one is faint. Being separate entries, they can part company, and one of them can be stronger than the other. In contrast, a regular form is not stored as two entries, but you generate the past tense form by rule. Hence, the regular form inherits whatever sense of familiarity or unfamiliarity that it inheres in the verb itself. Well, if that's how we get many of our regulars, where do the irregulars come from? The short answer is that irregular forms are the fossils of dead rules. Now, by symmetrical logic, if irregular forms depend on memory and hence are vulnerable when memory is weak, regular forms depend on rules and should be vulnerable whenever rules are fragile or weak, and that can happen if the rules become too complicated or obscure for a given generation of children to figure out. And indeed, most of our irregular vowel change patterns originally were generated by rules, really old rules, in the ancestor language Proto-Indo-European spoken 5,500 years ago, in which, for example, the past of senk was sonk, the ancestor of our sink, sank, sunk, and the past of ver was bore, the ancestor of our bear, bore. Well, what happened after that? Why did we leave this blessed state? I'm going to work through a very simplified and more recent example. In Middle English, you have the, say, the verb keep, which was regular. It got the suffix ed, forming keeped, but what you have to keep in mind is that in those days, people were into phonetic spelling, and the spelling reflected the pronunciation to a much greater extent than it does today. So in fact, this would have been pronounced something like kep, with a long A sound. Now, there was a second rule in English at the time which shortened vowels after you stuck a chunk on the end of a word. The general rough rationale is that a syllable is a unit of timing in speech, and if you glom on all this extra stuff in the end, there's some tendency for languages to develop rules that squish the vowel to keep the syllable within one tick of the speech metronome. And so what would have been kept was then shortened to kept. And similarly, in the language at the time, you had sleep, slept, creep, crept, feel, felt, mean, meant, and indeed throughout the language this phenomenon occurred, leaving forms like sheep, shepherd, Christ, Christmas, deep depth, 5/5, and many others. Then something happened. In the 15th century, there was a convulsion in the pronunciation of the long vowels in English known as the Great Vowel Shift, where the vowel that used to be pronounced A was now pronounced E, got transformed into I, and so on. The result was that forms like keep and kept no longer sounded related. Originally, it would have been keep and kept, long and short versions of the same word. Now they were keep and kept, two qualitatively different vowels. The shortening rule died. It was too opaque for children to discern, leaving us with the family of irregulars that we find today. Evidence is that new verbs that entered the English language after the Great Vowel Shift no longer underwent shortening and have come through today as intact as regulars. Forms like peep peeped from 1460 and seep seeped from 1790. They're not peep pept or seep sept. Well, let me turn now to a different puzzle, which is why irregular words sometimes show up with regular forms. This is a set of word puzzles that has long bedeviled the language mavens, verbivores, and word watchers. Puzzles like why you say all my daughter's friends are lowlifes, not all my daughter's friends are low lives, even though the ordinary irregular plural of life is lives. Similarly, you might say, I'm sick of dealing with all the Mickey Mouses in this organization, not the Mickey Mice. Ever since the Sony Walkman was introduced a little more than 20 years ago, people have been uncertain about its plural, but there is a strong faction that believes that it should be regular, such as the owner of this electronic shop, who literally bent the regular plural into the glass tubing of a neon sign, Walkmans rather than Walkmen. And my favorite example comes from another comic strip in which two little leaguers are benched and have a lot of time on their hands, so they ponder some of the mysteries of baseball. Why is home plate called that when it doesn't even resemble a plate? And why do they call it a strike when you've actually missed the ball and haven't hit anything at all? Plus, why does a baseball manager wear a uniform when he never plays? And why do they say a batter flied out instead of flew out? Indeed, no mere mortal has ever flown out to center field. Well, what this phenomenon shows is that sound can't be the only input to the past tense computation, because the same sound, such as fly, can go in one end of the device, but come out the other end of the device either as flew or flied, depending on some extra input. The question is, what is that extra input? And the most popular theory is the extra input is meaning. To fly out in baseball isn't the same thing as what birds do. The idea is that when you stretch the meaning, you weaken the associations to the past tense form, leading people to default to the regular. The question is, does stretching the meaning of a word weaken links to its irregular forms? The answer is no, that in 99% of the cases, changing the meaning of a verb does nothing to its past tense form. For example, if you use a noun as a metaphor, like a chessman, the plural is not chessmans, it's plain ordinary chessmen. Similarly, straw men, snowmen, sawteeth, God's children. And English is notorious for its hundreds of verbal idioms where the meaning is almost perversely unpredictable based on the ordinary meaning of the verb, such as to catch a cold. Nonetheless, the past tense is caught a cold, not catched a cold, despite the fact that catching a cold has very little to do with catching. Similarly, you find hundreds of other examples. Cut a deal, not cut it a deal, took a leak, bought the farm, hit the fan, blew him off, came off well, put out, went nuts, got a life, had a cow, on and on and on. So forget the stretched meaning theory. A better theory is that the extra input is grammatical structure. Remember that the whole point of grammar is to allow you to compute the properties of a new word from the properties of old words and the way that they're arranged. The quirky regularized irregulars opt out of this scheme. They have a structure that doesn't allow information about an old word in memory to apply to the new word. And now let me explain what all that verbiage means. Here's how words are normally built. For example, start out with the plain ordinary verb eat with its grammatical category, verb, a representation of its meaning, and its irregular past tense form ate. You then join it to the prefix over to get overeat, and now the question is, how are you going to use that new word? In notation, what do you put in this slot over here? The answer is simple. There is one privileged component of the word called the head, which is on the right, and all of its properties in memory get copied upstairs and applied to the newly created verb. So what kind of verb is overeat? Well, it's a verb because eat is a verb, and the verbhood bubbles up through that pipeline. What is the meaning of overeat? Well, it's a kind of eating too much, and that's because the meaning of eat bubbles up through this pipeline. Finally, what's the past tense of overeat? It's overate because the past tense form ate goes up through that pipeline. Let me quickly walk you through another example. Start off with the simple noun man. Join it with a verb to form the word workman. How do we know how to use workman? Well, we look at the rightmost element, the head, and we copy it along the right-hand edge. A workman is a noun because man is a noun. A workman means a kind of man because man means man. And the plural of workman is workmen because the plural of man is men, and that information gets copied upstairs. Okay. Now here's the punchline. There are a few words that can't be allowed to follow this scheme and get their properties from the rightmost element. The usual pathway has to be blocked for the word to work the way you want it to work. The result is that if there's an irregular form, it's trapped here in memory and has no way of getting up to be inherited by the word as a whole. The regular rule steps in as the default. Well, that was all very abstract. Now let me explain it concretely. Beginning with a lowlife. The crucial thing about a lowlife is that it's not a kind of life in the way that a workman is a kind of man, but rather it's a kind of person, namely a person who has or leads a low life. So you start off with the noun life, join it to the adjective low to form a low life. The problem is that the ordinary percolation of information has to be turned off in order that a low life mean what you want it to mean, namely not a kind of life, but a kind of person. Well, now that you've blocked the pipeline, there's no way for lives to get up either, and so you default to the regular S and you say low lives. This theory works for all the verbs that have this funny semantic property. Still life, plural still lifes, because it's not a kind of life, but a kind of painting. Saber-tooths rather than saber-teeth, because a saber-tooth is not a kind of tooth, but a kind of cat. Flat-foots, not a kind of foot, but a policeman. And this finally explains the mystery of the Sony Walkmans, not a kind of man at all. As it turns out, the Sony Corporation has an official answer to the frequently asked question, what is the plural of Walkman? The answer is Walkman brand personal stereos. In the interests of trademark protection, the last thing they want is for their name to devolve into a pluralizable noun. Well, that leads to the second class of funny examples, the Mickey Mouses. Here the crucial factor is that we have a noun that comes from a name, an eponym. And again, I'll show you the logic behind the word. Start off with the English word for mus musculus, namely mouse. Many years ago, Walt Disney converted that noun into a name by concatenating it with the name Mickey to come up with the name Mickey Mouse. Note that he did something unusual. Instead of getting a noun from a noun, he got a name from a noun. Then in ordinary slang, we did a second unusual thing. In common parlance, the word for a simpleton is a Mickey Mouse, where we convert the name back into a noun. Now, to turn a noun to a name, you've got to block the ordinary pipeline that would ordinarily make a noun into another noun. You have to block it a second time when you converted the name back into a noun. The irregular form mice is trapped down here, has no way of applying to the word as a whole, and the handy-dandy regular suffix fills the gap and gives us Mickey Mouses. Again, this isn't specific to this one example, but it happens whenever you turn a name into a noun and pluralize it. In Toronto, there's a hockey team, and each one of the players is a Maple Leaf. Collectively, they are the Toronto Maple Leafs, not the Maple Leaves. It's there, printed right on their sweater. Renault used to make a car called the Elf, plural elves. You might say Michael Keaton starred in the first two Batmans, not the first two Batmen. And you all know the famous chef Julia Child. Well, you might say, we're having Julia Child and her husband over for dinner. You know, the Childs are really great cooks. You wouldn't say the children are really great cooks. And finally, I'm going to explain the mystery of flying out, where here the crucial property is explained by Calvin and Hobbes in the following cartoon. Calvin tells his companion, I like to verb words. What? I take nouns and adjectives and use them as verbs. Remember when access was a thing? Now it's something you do. It got verbed. Verbing weirds language. Maybe we can eventually make language a complete impediment to understanding. Well, in fact, verbing doesn't really weird language all that much. We do it all the time. And that's what we do with fly out with interesting consequences. So begin with the ordinary verb to fly, meaning to slip the surly bonds of earth. In baseball, that verb got converted into a noun, a fly, meaning a ball hit on a conspicuously parabolic trajectory. That noun got turned back into a verb, to fly or to fly out, meaning to make an out by hitting a fly. To turn a verb into a noun, you've got to clog the pipeline, because ordinarily verbs beget other verbs. When you turn the noun back into a verb, you block it a second time, because ordinarily nouns beget new nouns. With the pipeline blocked twice, there's no way for flew and flown to pass up to apply to the new word as a whole, and as usual, the ED steps in as the emergency or default. Again, this isn't an explanation that was just jiggered up for this one case, but it works whenever you turn a noun into a verb. When a member of the hockey team nearly decapitates an opposing player and is sent to the penalty box for 2 minutes for high sticking, we say that he high sticked the goalie, not that he high stuck him, because the verb to high stick comes from the noun a stick. You might say Ventura grandstanded to the audience, not grandstood, because it comes from the noun grandstand, as in play to the grandstand. Or Powell ringed the city with artillery, not rang the city, because in this sense, ring means to form a ring around. It comes from a noun. Let me switch to the third set of phenomena, the errors of children. And the fact to be explained is nicely summed up in this cartoon. Mommy, Dolly hitted me. Dolly hit me. You too? Boy, she's in trouble. This is the phenomenon of overgeneralizing the regular ending that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Errors such as we holded the baby rabbits, my brother got sick and puked, or the alligator goed kerplunk. Here's a simple explanation, that children's memory retrieval is less reliable than adults. Not because kids have bad memories, but just because they haven't lived as long. That's what being a child means. And among the experiences that we accumulate as we mature is hearing the past tense forms of irregular verbs. If you're only 3 years old, there aren't that many times in which you've heard stood and broke and taken. If a child fails to retrieve an irregular from memory, and the child is in possession of the rule, the child can apply the rule to the irregular, yielding the error. Well, it's a simple theory. What's the evidence? Evidence that weak memory is a factor is the discovery that the less often a parent uses a particular irregular verb, the more often the child makes an error on it. This is something we found in every child that we've ever looked at. Evidence that acquiring the rule is the watershed event comes from the phenomenon that the errors with irregulars don't appear right away. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a graph of one child's use of irregular verbs from the age of 2 to the age of 5. Each dot is a month. You see, for 8 consecutive months, this boy never made an error like braked or cummed, just broke and came. Then, just before his 3rd birthday, he makes the first error, and he continues to make them at a kind of low sputtering rate for the next 3 years. The question is, what happened over here? Why does a child wake up one morning and start to say, taked and bringed? The explanation would be, that would be the point at which the child has figured out that in English, the past tense is ordinarily marked by ed. The evidence is that if you now plot how well the child was doing on regular verbs, that is, how often the child said, yesterday we walked, as opposed to just yesterday we walk, he goes from a phase of leaving out the ed more often than not to supplying it more often than not, and the transition is exactly the point at which he makes the first error with the irregular verbs. So this is a graph that catches the child in the act of learning a rule, which we see both in better performance where the rule ought to apply and slightly worse performance where the rule ought not apply. I'm going to switch now to an even more direct test of the words and rules theory, cases in which the word system or the rule system is damaged by injury or disease to the part of the brain that serves as its substrate. The prediction is that damage to the system for memory for words should hurt the irregulars, damage to the system for grammatical computation should hurt the regulars. And Michael Ullman and I looked at a variety of patients with strokes and other brain injuries, beginning with patients who had damage to this part of the brain, the posterior parasylvian region in the left hemisphere, approximately here, which tends to produce a symptom called anomia, a difficulty in finding words where you have fluent speech, relatively unimpaired grammar, but difficulty in slotting the words in, often use of generic words like thing and stuff and guy. We've found for this kind of patient, irregulars were harder than regulars, which makes sense if irregulars are stored in the mental dictionary, which is damaged in this kind of patient. High number of childlike errors like cummed and bringed, and not much trouble doing the WUG test. Today I WUG, yesterday I WUG'd, because the WUG test doesn't depend on memory. In contrast, a patient whose damage is in more anterior areas towards the front of the brain in the left hemisphere can often be stricken with a symptom called agrammatism, where there's great difficulty getting the words out in a fluent sequence, but often a less marked difficulty in naming individual actions or objects. Here you find exactly the opposite pattern. Irregulars are easier than regulars because the regulars require the grammatical apparatus, which is compromised. Few or no regularization errors, and this kind of patient cannot do a WUG test, exactly what you'd expect. We found a similar double dissociation with patients with Alzheimer's disease, a disease that tragically affects memory, including memory for words, including, by hypothesis, irregular forms, which they find harder, compared to patients with Parkinson's disease who have difficulty in planning and sequencing, including sequencing grammatical combinations. They have more trouble with regular verbs. Now, before I continue, I just want to mention a possible confounding factor that some spoil sport could raise. Among the properties of regular verbs are that they are the majority in English. As I mentioned, there are thousands and thousands of regular verbs, but only about 165 irregulars. Perhaps a skeptic could say that the regular pattern is generalized most freely simply because it's the most frequent. It's been pounded into our heads ever since we were children by all of those thousands of regular verbs. What's needed to rule out this alternative is to find a language where a regular rule applies to a minority of forms. Now, you might be startled there because in traditional language lessons, the teacher will often define the regular form as the most frequent one in the language, and so this statement would be an oxymoron. But I've been using regular and rule in a psychological sense to refer to that mental operation that the person carries out as the default. That says nothing about how many of the verbs undergo the rule, and a language like this, at least in theory, should be able to exist according to the words and rules theory. So it can exist in theory. The question is, does it exist in reality? Could there really be a language that's so twisted, so perverse, so sadistic, that it would actually force its speakers to memorize irregular forms for a majority of words in the language? Could there be such a language? I'm going to read a quotation to you from an essay by Mark Twain called Die Schrecken der deutschen Sprache, The Horrors of the German Language. A person who has not studied German can form no idea of what a perplexing language it is. One is washed about in it hither and thither in the most helpless way, and when at last he thinks he has captured a rule which offers firm ground to take a rest on amid the general rage and turmoil of the 10 parts of speech, he turns over the page and reads, "Let the pupil make careful note of the following exceptions." He runs his eye down and finds that there are more exceptions to the rule than instances of it. Perfect. And indeed, German does have its horrors. There are 3 kinds of participles, a vowel change and en, a vowel change and t, both of which are regular. Finally, just adding the t, which is the regular equivalent. The plural system is even more horrifying, with 8 different varieties, 4 suffixes, er, en, and s, no suffix at all, and just to keep speakers on their toes, some of the vowels can change more or less unpredictably. Of these 8 forms, it's the s that satisfies the requirements of the default according to our criteria. And it turns out that German is the exception that proves the rule, because whereas the English regular form occupies 86% of the top 1,000 verbs in the language, the German regular form only occupies 45% of the top 1,000 verbs. Nonetheless, when it comes to actually generalizing the form, English speakers and German speakers treat them the same, despite the difference in the statistics. We use ed for rare verbs like ablated. German speakers use it for t for rare verbs like gelötet, soldered. We use it for weird verbs that can't be analogized to anything that we are familiar with, as in plumped. German speakers use it for weird verbs such as geplauft. Plauf, by the way, is German for plump. We use it when we verb things, as in flied out, and German speakers use t when they verb things, as in gehaust, housed. Finally, English-speaking children say singed, German-speaking children say gesingt in about the same proportion at the same time. Even better evidence comes from a comparison of the plural, where the regular plural in English is used for 99.6% of our nouns, whereas the regular in German is used only for 7% of their nouns. Nonetheless, speakers generalize them in the same way. We have plumpfs, they have plaufs. We have the Julia Childs, they have Thomas Mann and his wife, die Thomas Manns, not die Thomas Menner. We enjoy productions of the Caped Crusader, Batmans. They enjoy productions of the Alchemist, Faust, plural Fausts. We import elves. They export cadets. And English-speaking children say mans, German-speaking children say mans, despite the fact that the ending that they generalize, s, occurs in only 7% of the nouns that they hear. And that leads to the final point before I conclude, which is why are English and grammar and German so similar in grammar, despite the fact that they're so different in numbers? And you have to do a little history to dig out the reason. In Proto-Germanic, the language spoken about 2,000 years ago that was the ancestor to both English and German, a majority of verbs are what we would today call irregular, but even back then they had an ed or t suffix, and even then it applied to loan words, words that came in from other languages, and for derived words, words that are formed from other words. It just so happens that in the next couple of millennia, in the English language, the major growth areas for verbs were loans from French and Latin because of 1066 and all that, when England was invaded by the Norman French and had to absorb thousands of French words, and later in the Renaissance, when many Latin words came into English. I've estimated that about 60% of the verbs in English came in from French or Latin. And as Calvin mentioned, we also like to verb things. Another 20% of our verbs started out life as nouns or adjectives. That means that right off the bat, 80% of our verbs had to be regular according to the grammatical logic that I outlined earlier in the talk. So it's not that a majority of verbs are regular, and that pounds the pattern in speakers' heads, causing them to use the regular as the default or the one to generalize. This is exactly backwards. It's that speakers of English and German have used the regular as the default literally for thousands of years, and that's why the majority of verbs became regular in English. It's because the regular rule got first dibs on all the new verbs coming into the language. Okay, now I'm really going to sum up. I've suggested that despite the identical function of regular and irregular forms, just two completely equivalent ways of talking about something that took place in the past or talking about more than one of something, the irregulars are avoided and the regular suffix is applied in a variety of circumstances that have nothing in common except a failure of access to information in memory. These include rare words like abrogated and chided, difficult to analogize words like plomped and frilged, words with inaccessible roots like lowlifes and flied out, words that are poorly recalled by children, as in braked and holded, and words that are poorly recalled by patients with disorders of word retrieval, such as anomia or Alzheimer's disease. What this shows is that the regular inflection has to be computed by some mental operation that does not need access to memory, namely a symbol combination rule which can step in as the default. Rules, therefore, free us from the constraints of memory. That's why we have them. Finally, I'd like to suggest that we've identified distinct mental mechanisms that implement the two principles of language that account for its vast expressive power, namely memory for the arbitrary sign underlying the word, and symbol combination for the infinite use of finite media underlying grammatical rules. Thank you very much. And are there any questions? I've been asked to remind you that if you have a question to please stand at the microphone. Or did I leave you speechless? Here comes someone. Yes, please stand at the microphone. Yes.
Hi, I read your book, and it seemed to me that most languages you described seem to do things such as vowel changes and all that sort of irregular verbs and everything. Being native speaker of Chinese, I don't think we do any of that.
Yes.
Is that true that Chinese is such like a really peculiar language?
Yes. Well, indeed, what you said is right. The Chinese has no inflection, that is, diddling with verbs for plural and past tense. It does have some rules that do things to words, such as compounding them. And most interesting, in Words and Rules, I have a brief discussion of Chinese where I've, thanks to a linguist named James Myers, I think we've spotted an operation of a default in Chinese, not for the a plural or a past tense, but in the classifier system.
Yeah. You have a classifier word for things that you don't know. But we don't, like, I know in both English, French, and Japanese, you do things to change the vowel, bring, spling to splung, and all that sort of thing. We don't do that at all in Chinese.
No, that's right. Chinese, and it's not that Chinese, well, first of all, as you noted, the Chinese does have a default operation in the case of classifiers. That is, there is a rule that you apply when all else fails, although, as you also point out, it isn't used to change the shape of words or the pronunciation. It's used to choose a prefix. But to get back to your main question, namely, what's the deal with Chinese? Is it just weird? One way of thinking about it is that you often find a continuum of languages, where Chinese is at one end in doing most of the work in the syntax, that is, by arranging words within phrases and sentences, and not doing anything within the confines of the word itself, with prefixes and suffixes and vowel changes. At the other end, you have languages like Russian and the Australian language Warlpiri, where you can almost completely scramble the orders of words, but because you mark who did what to whom on the word itself, people know what happened. Chinese is at one extreme. English is pretty close to Chinese because we've lost most of our inflection. Both being isolating languages. That's exactly right. Yeah. This has never happened before. I think people are camera shy.
Suspend the rule and just have you repeat the question.
No, we have another volunteer. And I'm willing to repeat the question if you'd like to pose it from your seat.
Hi. I'm curious as to whether there's any sort of reason for, with animals we say a flock of geese, we might say a group of cattle. There seem to be a lot of irregular plurals. And then with certain animals, it's like a herd of moose, one moose, but a herd of moose, one fish, school of fish.
Yeah, it is true that many of the irregulars, lice, mice, geese, and fish, deer, cod, sheep, tend to occur with animals. In general, you often get irregular plurals to refer to things that typically come in bunches or clusters. Teeth is another example, and I think the reason is that it's captured in the saying, he can't see the forest for the trees, or the whole is more than the sum of the parts. There's a gestalt shift that we can make between conceptualizing a bunch of things as a bunch of things, or as a conglomerate, a gang, a bunch. And when it's easy to construe a group as a unified collection, there's a temptation to give it its own word, and there's a slight pull to the irregular in those cases. This is something that you see in many languages, and you can even see the process where what starts out as a regular plural starts to congeal into an irregular. My favorite example is children, which is actually a double plural. The R in children is the ER from earlier stages in the language, ultimately from Germanic. It used to be roughly childer. Then people stopped perceiving that as a plural, and then to pluralize it, they stuck a second plural on, the archaic plural en. There's some people learning English as a second language who still don't think of it as plural, and will talk about children's. Three plurals. And this is something that you see happening many times over the history of the language, and typically with things that come in broods or sets or flocks.
Is there something that we may default to if there are, for instance, new species that would be developed? Would we default to the regular form for that?
Usually we would, unless something is very highly similar to an existing set of nouns, for the same reason that we guess that the past of spling is splang. If there was a new word like a splouse, it wouldn't surprise me if some percentage of people would guess that its plural is splice.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is outside of your work, but I'm just curious, after listening to this ending part, about the actual origin of the rules themselves. If they are not common in the proto-languages, then where did they come from?
Yeah. When we can catch a language changing before our eyes, such as in the development of Creole languages, or when we can reconstruct the changes when there's, say, written records or other hints, you often see a suffix coming from what used to be a separate word, gradually eroding when people started to swallow it, and eventually it gloms on to a preceding word. There's one hypothesis that, for example, the ed in Germanic was a reduced form of the verb to do. And in fact, the ancestor of ed in Proto-Germanic kind of acts the way the verb do acts in many languages. For example, to turn a noun into a verb in many languages, say to hammer would be hammer do. It's not a stretch to think that what started out as hammer do could then turn into hammered as the do starts to get swallowed and then attached to the preceding word. And often words like take, go, and so on first become what are called clitics, that is, words that have to attach themselves to a neighboring word and then get worn down until they are prefixes or suffixes.
So are you saying that the regular verbs were verbs that didn't actually have a past tense in the language, and so this past tense was created? The irregular verbs had a past tense from the beginning?
No, you get a sort of constant revolution where verbs can go from irregular to regular or from regular to irregular in a variety of ways. So what starts out as a rule can then start to get more and more complicated and opaque. The rule stops being applied, and the forms that it previously generated just get memorized individually as irregulars. That's one way that irregulars can happen. On the other hand, a rule can arise when a verb like to do gets reanalyzed as a suffix. If people forget an irregular, it will turn to regular. If people analogize an irregular, as in sneak, snuck, or spling, splung, or blind, blound, you get a new irregular. So there's a constant shuffling and churning where words can go from one category to another, depending on how long a span of time you look at. Yes?
Why do you think the situation between English and German is completely reversed when it comes to writing? If you want to figure out how a written English word is pronounced, there's basically only exceptions and normal rules, whereas in German it's the opposite. Everything is rule-governed.
Yeah, it's a good question, and one of the reasons is the great vowel shift, which rotated the pronunciation of the long vowels, but the spelling didn't keep up with the change. So we have in part, a spelling system that reflects the way the language used to be pronounced. And I don't know enough about the history of the German language to know whether they did or didn't have an equivalent shift, but I suspect that it wasn't as radical. And there are I think also because English, because of the Norman invasion and the influx of French words, English became a kind of hybrid language. Our vocabulary, it's almost as if we're all kind of bilinguals. And so a spelling system that worked for the Germanic side of the language didn't work as simultaneously for the Latin side and vice versa. There are probably many other just historical quirks, things that happened in England around the time that spelling started to get standardized that may not have happened in German. So I suspect that it's not one answer, but a number of factors. It's a good question. Yes?
Question on...
Which one?
You go first. You're brave enough to go to the mic.
Since there were obviously no sound recording available at the time, how is it known that this great vowel shift occurred? And
yes.
Is there any theory about why it occurred?
Yes. No, it's true that the speakers of English in that period, unlike Richard Nixon, did not tape all their conversations for the benefit of future historians. There are a number of ways, and I think that linguists have reconstructed the sound pattern of the language with a great deal of confidence. Partly it's the spellings, which originally had some rationale in reflecting the sound. Partly there were a number, because the spelling was always a concern. It was always a kind of kludgy, imperfect system, and people were always trying to improve it. There were a number of scholars, I think they were called orthoepists, Morris, did I remember correctly, and discussed in a very interesting way in the book by Chomsky and Halley, who actually were the linguists of their time and wrote down how the language was pronounced according to their ears, the better to devise an improved spelling system for it. There are clues from poetry. If Shakespeare, for example, rhymed S-A-Y and S-E-A, or had a pun based on them, one can guess that they may have been pronounced in the same way. You can see the way a sound affects its neighbors, which often is quite predictable, and by combining all of these different sources of information, it's kind of like a detective story, and in many cases you can really eliminate all the possibilities and guess with a lot of confidence. Yes?
Inherent in the notion of a rule is some sense of stability. Conversely, some of the examples you've cited invoke a change in rule or rules becoming too complicated for a generation to learn. So there's sort of this balance between the stability and the change. You cited one example of a change, for example, invasion and imposition of a foreign language. Is there any reason to believe that there's inherent propensity to change? You've talked about churning and turmoil. Are these rules, where does the variation come from? Is it inherent? Could you comment?
Yeah, it's a good question. Ultimately, it comes from the fact that language isn't designed by a standardization committee, like the ISO, but it's a grassroots phenomenon that emerges from millions of pairs of people in conversation. And there are all kinds of reasons that people might change the way they speak. People will often slur their speech or swallow the ends of words to get the words out more quickly. Conversely, they might exaggerate or embroider things in order to make themselves better understood or to affect a fancy, fussy tone or a detached, cool tone. Because of simply the mechanics of the mouth and the brain circuits that control speech, there are a number of habits that people have in pronouncing things when they are all joined up in a row that can cause one to change to another. Words fall out of fashion, new slang words come in. So there are dozens of ways in which people change the way they speak. If you imagine, some of them will become epidemic. Kids will copy other kids, and the language will gradually change. And when you add up all of these little changes, then the sound pattern of a language or the grammar of a language can change as a whole, and eventually you get it turning into a new language altogether.
Is it a prediction of the theory that you've just presented that as languages, or as sort of different groups of people interact, the language becomes more regular, like in the English case? Because that seems a little bit counterintuitive. You'd think the more heterogeneous different peoples are and interact, the more irregular the language would act. It seems like a prediction that it would get more regular.
It's a very good question. It often happens that, say, when you have a language that is spread through invasion, and all of a sudden it's forced on a bunch of subordinate people, then it often does simplify, simply because the people don't have access to all of the forms like smite, smote, and tread, trod, and bear, bore, and forsake, forsook. If you haven't been listening to a language long enough, those are the forms that will be most vulnerable. And I think there are a number of cases in history where an invading language gets simplified in exactly that way, becomes more regular. I'm not a Latin scholar, but I believe that's what happened when Latin turned into the Romance languages, that some of the irregularities were lost.
Yes, I may go back to your language instinct book, which is the only one I've been able to read up to now, because it's about 420 pages. I see this book as a little bit more streamlined, so I'm excited about that project.
It's a man with a life.
Yes. You say in that book that children are geniuses of language because they're able to acquire a complex grammar instinctually. And my question is, why doesn't the evolving human species with a brain that's evolving come up with something that's simpler, a simpler grammar? Because if language is a phenomenon of a biological organ, why doesn't it streamline its activities like other organs in our body?
For example, why not do away with the irregulars, since they're just...
Or do away with all these things that German has.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I can't give a definitive example, but I'll give kind of the general idea, which is that I suspect that a lot of the richness of language comes from the fact that you have these two competing mechanisms. So ideally, you could imagine, almost like the John Wilkins perfect language of the Enlightenment, where everything was rational, everything was predictable, deducible, and so on. But since you don't have that kind of language, we are equipped with a mechanism that simply memorizes individual words. And for reasons I explained, that's a good thing to do when you've got several tens of thousands of concepts that just need labels. Well, once you equip a human brain with the ability to memorize words, it's going to be hard to stop it from occasionally memorizing rule-produced forms, even though it doesn't have to. But the two mechanisms are powerful enough that each one can do some of the job that the other one is in some sense designed to do. And so with the word system, sometimes memorizing things, once they're memorized, they can then drift, kind of like the game of broken telephone, where one child whispers a word into the ear of the next and so on, and then the message gets comically garbled at the end. That's kind of what happens in language transmission from generation to generation, that memory is good but not perfect, and memory can sometimes hoover up forms that originally were cranked out by rules. And I think it's because of the interplay of these two systems, each one capable of doing some of the work of the other, that we end up with language with all of its richness and quirks. And we should be thankful for it, because even though it's a little less logical, it gives scope for poetry and wordplay and rhetoric and choosing the word with the perfect sound and connotation. So it's certainly something that I'm thankful for.
In the 1920s, the Turkish language switched from Arabic letters to Latin letters. And then during that time, every word, the spelling became phonetic, which is very easy for the kids to learn. It was almost like a revolution. Are there other languages that have similar changes and revolutions? I don't know if you're familiar with this.
Yes, there are. And basically languages, many of the languages that in one sense, or many of the European groups that in one sense were kind of backward in the sense that they were left behind in all of the technological and literary advances of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, had the good fortune of getting alphabets that were introduced fairly recently and hence are pretty regular, because they haven't been around for enough centuries for all of the quirks and irregularities to accumulate. So I think there are a number of European languages, of Slavic languages, Eastern European languages, that got the Latin alphabet late, at a point at which, and it's a point that's recent enough for it to be still fairly pristine. Up at the top, there.
My question ties in with the last couple of questions, and that's if languages, or human languages, instinctual or innate or is a byproduct of our own neurochemistry, and given that the brain sometimes rewires itself in the cases of accidents and so forth, what are your ideas on an optimal language and one that would use the brain to its as effectively as possible? And I think it was one of your ideas that language and thinking are intimately related. And so what would your ideas be on a language that can enhance thinking?
So the question is, given what we know about the brain, could one conceive of an ideal, optimal language that would take maximal advantage of the brain? And is there a language that one could think of that would enhance or improve thinking? I would be hesitant to second guess existing languages, which are pretty remarkably good. And the reason that they're good isn't so much that our ancestors were geniuses and thought up words for everything that needed a label, but that a language is always a moving target. And when a language doesn't do what you want it to do, it's not that you can't think the thought and you sort of bumble around blindly, or you're enslaved, as in 1984, where the Newspeak language literally didn't allow people to think thoughts like freedom because the words didn't exist. I don't think it works that way, because if we don't have a word, we coin one. We invent the word to spam or to flame. We start out with slang or jargon or argot or patois, and if it's useful enough, it will catch on. So if there's a deficiency in language, at least for things like talking about things and who did what to whom and properties of things and places, then the speakers of the language will shape it to do what they need it to do. So I guess all languages are optimal or can be optimal in the sense that if there's something they're not good at, it's almost certain that the speakers will change it as a result.
Is it possible that as an alternative to a perfect language, people might speak several languages? And what long-term effects are there on the brain in children who've perhaps spoken 3 languages by the age of 6?
Yeah. Yeah, indeed, more people speak several languages than speak only one language if you look across the whole world. So this is not by no means an unusual state of affairs. I don't think that bilingualism has any does any harm. It used to, and this might sound banal, of course it wouldn't do any harm, but believe it or not, for many years, people thought that learning 2 languages would harm the child, it would make them, confused or, schizophrenic, or associate one language with masculine and one language with feminine. And pediatricians often used to advise parents to only use one language with their child so as not to confuse them. We now know that that's all nonsense, that kids are very good at growing up with multiple languages and it doesn't do them any harm. Whether it helps, I think the advantage is the obvious one, namely that there are 2 groups of people that you can communicate with. You know what to order on the menu when you go to France. In some cases, you have 2 choices of mnemonic devices that you can use when you're figuring something out and have to hold a little stretch of language in memory. But I don't think it has any dramatic effect in the sense of making you think in a fundamentally different way or changing your worldview. These are substantial advantages, but they're not anything beyond what common sense would tell you. Yes?
I just have a kind of simple question for you. You were mentioning about the Toronto Maple Leafs earlier. The Minnesota basketball team is called the Timberwolves. Yeah. Is that just because they're animals?
Yes. Yeah, I knew that would come up. Yeah, there is
a different question because I've never actually heard any single player called the Timberwolf before, so I don't know what the singular would be for that team.
Well, that's... Thank you.
Along those same lines, what's the singular for an Orangeman from Syracuse? Or
a member
from NC State,
or a member of our own baseball team, the Red Sox.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very rare to hear a player describe himself as a Red Sox. There's a discussion of the damn Timberwolves in Words and Rules, and in fact, you have provided the answer in the sense that you can, when you name a sports team, there are 2 ways to go. You can metaphorically name a player, and then the name for the team is the plural. Or you can choose a plural or a collective noun or a mass noun for the team as a whole, and then if you need a singular, you try and work backwards, and in some cases you don't even have one, like a member of the Orlando Magic or the Miami Heat. And a plausible story is that in the case of the Maple Leafs, the sequence was Canada has a symbol, the maple leaf, which naturally can be paired with a single player. So you start off with a singular and then you pluralize it, whereas wolves travel in packs. And it's the metaphor of a team of players being identified with a pack of wolves is cognitively inviting. So you start off with the plural, and then as you point out, it's kind of a leap to derive the singular from it. And the evidence for that, aside from the fact that you, and I'm grateful, brought up the answer, is that there are teams where we can actually see the entire team being named and the singular being obscure, as in the Red Sox or the Magic.
Why don't you call them singulars? Because I mean, we do everything else simplify. Why do we still say that one member of our night? Why do we say like here?
You often see players and sports announcers struggling with it. I've seen an interview with I think it was Wade Boggs, who said, "Ever since I've been a Red Sox." I think it's a little bit better than Red Sox, but there really is no singular, and it's just a consequence of the fact that the combination of the spelling or the plural metaphor that you begin with sometimes paints you into a corner.
Yes. So you had a rationale for regularization of words used in novel contexts like Walkmans, for example. What about words like mouse? I think when computer mice first came out, they were mouses, and now they're mice again. What's with that?
Computer mouse. That is the question that I guess asked more often than any other question. What's the deal with the computer mouse? Well, the facts are, I don't think as far as I can tell, the sequence was not from mouses to mice. Is that what you suggested? Generally, people are kind of squeamish with all of the alternatives. Mouses remains pretty rare. Mice is more common, and just that people grimace a bit when they say it. I actually did a survey where the subjects were ads in Computer Shopper magazine, and the ads were divided between mice and pointing devices, and there were no instances of mouses. So I think it's not as strong an effect as you get in something like as in Mickey Mouses or in Lowlifes or Sabertooths or Flatfoots. People tend not to go all the way over to the regular. And I think the reason is different. The theory that I presented, in fact, does not explain why people are squeamish about the pointing devices. And they are, just to try and put it in a nutshell, I think it is an effective meaning, although it's not the meaning of mouse, which is perfectly transparent. You can see the tail and the body, and in fact there's a wireless pointing device which is known as a hamster. The reason is that if you have to dedicate a slot in memory to the ordinary plural mice because of its idiosyncratic sound, mice instead of mouses, then you've got a slot in which you can also store any idiosyncrasies of that particular meaning. So you've got a place, a hook or a pigeonhole in memory in which you can store what it's like to encounter a bunch of mice, like an infestation. And as opposed to what you do with a regular form, like rats, where you don't have a slot for rats, because you can compute it with the rule, and so therefore the concept of rats is more than one of, and the concept rat. Whereas for mice, the concept is, it's almost like an image of a bunch of mice all over the place. Well, now when you extend it metaphorically, you're actually extending the plural mice together with its semantic baggage, the image that you have of a bunch of mice, which doesn't apply aptly when you've got one pointing device attached to a computer. When you have this mismatch of kind of aggregation, then you get some squeamishness. That's the general rule. And there are other examples. I mean, this sounds very hokey, but there's a family of examples that work the same way. For example, if you say there was a dignitary seated at the foot of every table, then it sounds a bit strange to say there were dignitaries seated at the feet of the tables. Or there's a cabin at the foot of every mountain, but there were cabins at the feet of the mountains. Makes it seem like the mountain should have several feet. Another example is if you can refer to someone as a filthy louse, but if there are a bunch of them, to say, you filthy lice, doesn't work that. Or silly geese, or you clumsy oxen. It gets back to the earlier question of why teams of animals tend to get irregulars, and it's because you could have a concept of that kind of aggregation or multitude, and that makes the plural a little bit more difficult to transfer to a metaphorical sense if the way in which the new item can come in multitudes is different from the typical way in which the original item comes in multitudes. And it all owes back to the fact that once you have to memorize something because of its unpredictable sound, you've got a slot in memory where you can also store the idiosyncrasies of the meaning of a bunch of that kind of thing. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and remind you that Professor Pinker will sign books, and you can join this conversation and ask more questions and get more answers from more different people on Cognet. So see you soon.
Hi.
Steven Pinker is director for the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His other books include The Language Instinct and How the Mind Works.